You know, when we think about global power, it's easy to picture like a single spotlight on just one or maybe two major players.
Right. That's the common view.
But the material you've brought us today, it paints a really different picture, a much more dynamic stage, you know, multiple centers of gravity emerging.
It really does. It pushes back against that idea of just one superpower dominating everything after the Cold War. It shows how influence is much more spread out now.
Exactly. And thanks for sharing these sources, these excerpts. They really get into the details of these contemporary power centers, how they emerged.
Yeah, it's a fascinating look at how different regions, different nations have kind of navigated the last few decades to build up their own influence, often in ways that are, well, quite different from the old models.
So our mission for this deep dive, working through these sources with you, the listener, is to unpack all of that. We want to understand the journeys these powers took, the different ways their influence shows up, and maybe get a sense of what the future looks like, at least according to this material.
Let's find those key insights together.
Okay, so the sources really start by highlighting that big shift, right? The end of the bipolar world order back in the early 1990s. What's the main takeaway they pull from that?
Well, the key thing they emphasize is that the Soviet Union collapsing didn't just, leave the U.S. alone on top, unchallenged.
Right, not quite that simple.
No. Instead, that period really opened the door for alternative centers of power, political, economic, to emerge. And importantly, the sources suggest these rising forces could actually, potentially, limit U.S. dominance.
So it wasn't just one fills the vacuum, it created space, room for others to grow.
Precisely. And the sources, they really zero in on a few key examples to illustrate this.
Who are the main players they focus on?
Well, there are two major regional blocs that get a lot of attention. The European Union, the EU, obviously in Europe.
Okay.
And then the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, over in Asia.
So regional projects that kind of grew into something much bigger.
Exactly, becoming real forces to reckon with. And then, of course, the material spends a lot of time on the incredible economic rise of China.
Can't ignore that one.
No, definitely not. It's presented as having a huge impact on global politics. And the sources also give a nod to Japan and South Korea, acknowledging their continued significance in Asia.
Let's dig into the EU first. Its story, starting from the rubble of World War II, is really central in these texts. It kicks off with what they call the question of Europe in 1945.
Yeah, Europe was devastated. Economies ruined, the old political structures shattered. The big question was, do they go back to the old rivalries or try something completely new?
And the sources make a really interesting point that the Cold War, maybe weirdly, actually helped push European integration forward.
It did, in a way. Having that clear external threat from the Soviet Union gave them a strong reason to cooperate. Plus, there was crucial help from outside.
You mean the Marshall Plan, the massive American financial aid?
Exactly. And the structure they set up to handle that aid, the OEC, Organization for European Economic Cooperation, back in 1948, that became a really important early space for Western European countries to work together economically.
So economics first. Then came moves towards political cooperation, like the Council of Europe a year later.
It was very much a step-by-step thing, deliberate. That economic path eventually led to the European Economic Community, the EEC, with the Treaty of Rome in 1957.
And then adding the European Parliament gave it more of a political feel, but the sources stress how the end of the Soviet bloc really put the foot on the accelerator.
Oh, absolutely. That whole period was a catalyst. It led directly to the creation of the European Union, the EU proper, in 1992 with the Maastricht Treaty.
And Maastricht set out some big ambitions, didn't it? A common foreign and security policy, cooperation on justice, home affairs, and the single currency.
Right. And the key insight here is how the EU evolved past just being about economics. The sources point out it became more and more political. It started acting, more like a nation state in some ways, even though attempts at a formal constitution failed.
It got the symbols, though. The flag, the 12 stars for unity and all that, an anthem, a founding date, the euro.
Yes, and it developed common policies for dealing with the outside world. The sources actually lay out a pretty detailed timeline of this whole evolution, hitting the key milestones.
Yeah, I see that, like the early coal and steel community in 51, the EEC in 57, the UK, Ireland, Denmark joining in 73.
And that really important Schengen Agreement in 85, starting to get rid of internal border checks. You mentioned in your notes how that finally clicked the whole Schengen visa thing into place. That's a perfect example of how these historical steps still affect us, right?
Totally. Made it real. The timeline keeps going. Spain, Portugal join, Germany reunifies, the EU formally established 92, the single market 93, more members mid-90s, then the big 2004 expansion.
The euro actually launching in 2002 for 12 countries, Bulgaria and Romania in 07, the Lisbon Treaty in 09 winning the Nobel Peace Prize, Croatia joining in 2013.
And ending, noted here, with the Brexit referendum in 2016. A big moment.
Definitely. But what this timeline also shows, and the sources point this out, is that it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were real challenges with expanding so quickly and integrating so deeply.
Like resistance from some countries about giving up power.
Exactly. Pushback against handing over too much national authority to Brussels. And debates, reservations about bringing in certain new members. It shows that constant tension, between national identity and this bigger supranational idea.
So this unique entity, the EU, what kind of clout does it actually have on the world stage based on these readings?
Well, economically, it's huge. The sources state it was the world's second biggest economy back in 2016, over $17 trillion, just behind the U.S.
And the euro, its currency, is presented as a potential rival to the dollar's dominance.
Yeah, and maybe even more significantly, its share of world trade is actually larger than the U.S.'s. That's a key point in the sources.
Okay, so that gives it real weight.
Absolutely.
Right.
It means the EU can be pretty assertive in trade disputes, even when dealing with giants like the U.S. or China. And that economic power translates into influence with its neighbors and also further out in places like Asia and Africa.
Plus, it acts as a single, powerful voice in places like the World Trade Organization.
For sure. And then there's the political and diplomatic side. France has that permanent seat on the UN Security Council, and other EU members are often on there as non-permanent members. Gives it a platform.
The sources even suggest this, let the EU shape some U.S. policies. They mention the current U.S. stance on Iran's nuclear program as an example.
Right, and its whole approach to foreign policy often looks different. The sources highlight its preference for diplomacy, economic tools, negotiation, rather than defaulting to military force. The dialogue with China on human rights and the environment is cited as an example of that approach.
Okay, what about military power?
Well, if you combine all the member states' armed forces, it's the second largest in the world. And their total defense spending is also second, only after the U.S.
And France has nuclear weapons.
That adds another layer, yes. Plus, the EU is noted as the world's second most important hub for space and communications technology.
So it's got power in lots of different areas. The sources also make sure to point out the limits, right, because of how it's structured.
Exactly. They really stress that it is a supranational body, but it's built from sovereign member states. And those states often keep their own separate foreign and defense policies, and sometimes those policies clash.
Like the Iraq War example. Britain backing the U.S., Germany, and France strongly against it.
That's the classic example they use. And they also talk about that underlying Euroscepticism you find in some parts of Europe. Think Thatcher keeping the UK out of the single market initially, or Denmark and Sweden resisting the euro. That kind of thing ultimately limits how effectively the EU can act as one single voice on foreign policy or defense.
All right, let's shift gears and head east. The sources bring up ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Totally different historical context here compared to Europe.
Oh, completely different. Southeast Asia, went through layers of colonialism, European, then Japanese during World War II. After the war, these newly independent countries were grappling with huge problems. Well, nation building from scratch, widespread poverty, economic backwardness, and on top of all that, intense pressure from the Cold War superpowers to pick a side. The sources literally call it a recipe for conflict.
And earlier attempts at broader cooperation across Asia or the developing world hadn't really stuck.
No, things like the Bandung Conference or the Non-Aligned Movement, they set some precedents for informal cooperation but didn't create lasting structures in the same way. So the Southeast Asian nations decided to build their own thing.
Which became ASEAN in 1967. Signed the Bangkok Declaration, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand.
That's right. And their initial goals were very practical, very focused inward.
Like economic growth, social progress, cultural development.
Exactly. Those were the primary aims. But there was a secondary objective, too, a really important one, promoting peace and stability within the region, based on rule of law, UN principles.
And it grew over time from those original 5 to 10 members now.
Yes, eventually covering most of Southeast Asia. And here's a crucial difference from the EU that the sources highlight. There was very little appetite in ASEAN for creating supranational bodies, for giving up sovereignty.
So they came up with the ASEAN Way? What is that exactly?
The sources describe it as a style of interaction. It's informal, it avoids confrontation, it's highly cooperative. And the absolute bedrock principle is respect for national sovereignty and not interfering in each other's internal business. It's about cooperation between equals.
Very different philosophy to the EU trying to integrate. But the sources do say that as the region developed economically, ASEAN's goals started to expand a bit.
They did. In 2003, they agreed to aim for an ASEAN community based on 3 pillars: a security community, an economic community, and a sociocultural community. The sources actually say this is kind of moving along the path of the EU, but crucially, while keeping that core respect for sovereignty.
Okay, tell me about the security community part.
The main idea there is to prevent disagreements, especially over territory, from boiling over into actual fighting. The members commit to peace, neutrality, cooperation, non-interference, respecting differences. And they set up the ASEAN Regional Forum, the ARF, back in '94, as a place to talk about security and foreign policy stuff.
And the economic community. The sources still say ASEAN is mainly an economic group.
It is, primarily. Now, its total economy isn't as big as the US or EU or Japan individually, but it's growing much, much faster. And that growth gives it increasing influence. The main goal is creating a common market and production base to help development and trade flow better.
Focusing on a free trade area for investment, labor, services. And it's interesting, the sources note that big players like the US and China have actually negotiated free trade deals with ASEAN as a single bloc.
Right. That really shows its growing weight in the region. ASEAN's Vision 2020 plan talked about playing a more outward-looking role. The sources credit it with helping negotiate solutions to conflicts, like in Cambodia or during the East Timor crisis. And its yearly meetings have become important forums for wider East Asian cooperation, too.
And its economic connections are vital, especially with other growing Asian economies like India and China. The sources mention India's Look East and now Act East policies and the ASEAN-India Free Trade Agreement.
So, summing it up, the sources present ASEAN's strength as coming from this unique approach: interaction, consultation, respecting sovereignty. They highlight it as the only regional group in Asia that provides a political forum where both Asian countries and the major world powers can sit down and discuss political and security issues.
Okay, let's pivot to the third major alternative power center the sources focus on: China.
And the message from the sources here is crystal clear. China's phenomenal economic success since the late 1970s is the absolute foundation of its return as a major global power. It's been the fastest growing big economy since those reforms kicked off.
And there are projections mentioned here that it could overtake the U.S. economy by 2040.
Exactly. And that sheer economic weight has huge regional consequences. It's so integrated now, it's basically the engine of East Asian growth that gives it enormous influence there.
Can we rewind a bit? What was the situation before those big reforms? After the 1949 revolution under Mao, it followed a Soviet model.
Largely, yes. The sources describe a country that was economically quite backward. It had cut itself off from the capitalist world, trying to rely on its own resources, plus some early limited Soviet help. The focus was all on building up state-owned heady industry, using capital squeezed out of agriculture.
And because they didn't have much foreign currency, they had to try and make everything themselves, import substitution.
Right. Now that early model, it wasn't a total failure. It did lay some industrial foundations, provided basic jobs and welfare, made gains in education and health compared to many developing nations, and achieved, respectable growth rates, 5-6%.
But the sources say it ran into serious problems by the 1970s, a crisis even.
Yeah, population was growing faster than the economy.
Yeah.
Agriculture just couldn't produce enough surplus to feed the industrial sector. Industrial production wasn't growing fast enough. Foreign trade was tiny. Per capita income was still really low. The system was stagnating, much like the Soviet Union's eventually did.
Which forced some major changes in thinking and policy in the 70s.
First big step, ending the isolation. Reestablishing relations with the United States in 1972 was huge.
Then Premier Zhou Enlai proposed the 4 modernizations in 73, targeting agriculture, industry, science and tech, and the military.
And then the really pivotal moment came in 1978. The new leader, Deng Xiaoping, announced the open door policy and sweeping economic reforms. The clear aim was to generate much higher productivity by bringing in foreign money and foreign technology.
And a key point the sources emphasize is how China did this. It wasn't the shock therapy approach used elsewhere. It was gradual, step by step.
Exactly. Very controlled. They started by privatizing agriculture in 82. Industry came much later, in 98. Initially, they only lowered trade barriers in specific areas, these special economic zones, or SEZs, to carefully manage foreign investment.
And the sources make this clear. The state didn't just step back. It played, and still plays, a really central role in setting up and guiding this market economy.
This unique path, well, it had dramatic results, positive ones, at least economically. It completely broke the stagnation.
Privatizing farming led to a huge jump in food production and rural incomes. And all that saving in the countryside fueled incredible growth in rural industries.
Yeah, the whole economy, industry, and agriculture just started growing much faster. The new trade rules, the SEZs, they led to this phenomenal explosion in foreign trade. China became like the #1 place for foreign companies to invest.
It built up massive foreign currency reserves, which let it start investing heavily in other countries itself. And joining the World Trade Organization in 2001 locked it deeper into the global economy.
And the sources note it's not stopping there. It's looking to integrate even further and wants a big say in shaping the future rules of the global economy.
But the sources are also very direct about the downsides, the negative consequences inside China that came with these reforms.
Yes, they don't shy away from that. They state clearly that not everyone benefited equally. Unemployment became a big issue. Millions looking for work. Working conditions for women in some sectors are described in sources as being like 18th or 19th century Europe. Pretty stark.
And other problems too. Environmental damage getting worse, corruption increasing, and a big jump in inequality, right? Between city and countryside, coastal areas, and the interior.
So yes, a massive transformation, but one with significant internal costs and challenges. Still, that economic power gives it huge regional and global influence.
Because it's so interconnected now, it has real leverage with its trading partners. The sources suggest economic ties often soften other disagreements it might have with Japan, the US, ASEAN, even Russia.
It even hopes that economic integration might eventually help resolve the situation with Taiwan, which it still views as a renegade province.
The sources also give China credit for helping to stabilize the ASEAN economies after the 97 financial crisis. That apparently helped ease some regional fears about its growing power.
Right. And now its increasing investments in aid, especially in places like Latin America and Africa, are positioning it as a major global player, often seen as championing the interests of the developing world.
Now, one really crucial relationship the sources examine in detail is between China and India. Historically, they were both huge powers in Asia before the West arrived.
Yet, China had its sphere of influence, its tributary system covering places like Korea, Tibet, parts of Southeast Asia. India had its influence through various kingdoms. But interestingly, the sources point out their spheres didn't really overlap much. So historically, they didn't interact a lot, didn't know each other that well.
But after independence, there was that moment of optimism, wasn't there? Hindi Chini Bye-Bye Indians and Chinese are brothers, a hope they could lead the developing world together.
A very brief moment, unfortunately. That hope, the sources say, was pretty quickly damaged by conflict, mainly the border dispute. Differences emerged over China's takeover to Tibet in 1950, and then arguments about where the border actually lay.
Which led to that border war in 1962, fought mainly in Arunachal Pradesh and the Aksai Chin area of Ladakh. India, the sources state, suffered military setbacks, and relations went into a deep freeze afterward.
Yeah, diplomatic ties were downgraded for years, until 1976. Things only started to thaw slowly, especially after China's leadership changed in the late 70s and became more pragmatic, less focused on ideology. China seemed willing to sort of put the really difficult issues to one side for a while to try and improve the overall relationship. Border talks finally started again in 1981.
And the sources say that since the Cold War ended, the relationship has changed again. It's not just economic now, it's strategic too. Both countries see themselves as rising powers wanting major roles in Asia and globally.
And there have been real efforts to improve things, to cooperate. Rajiv Gandhi's visit to China in 1988 was a big step. They agreed on measures to keep the border peaceful, peace and tranquility.
Signed agreements on cultural stuff, science, technology, opened up some border posts for trade.
And the economic side just took off. The sources quote trade growing like 30% a year since 1999. It went from barely $300 million in 92 to over $84 billion by 2017. That sheer volume of trade has definitely created, reasons to keep things stable.
They even agreed to cooperate on things like bidding for energy resources overseas. and to coordinate in places like the WTO.
But, and this is crucial, the sources are very clear that serious tensions remain. And they explicitly mention a recent downslide in relations.
What are the friction points? Well, India's 1998 nuclear tests were sometimes justified by pointing to a threat from China. There are concerns about China helping Pakistan's nuclear program.
And China's military relationships with countries like Bangladesh and Myanmar are sometimes seen in India as being counter to its own interests in South Asia.
Now, while listing these issues, the sources, presenting things impartially, historically noted that none of them seemed likely on their own to cause a major conflict. Border talks were ongoing, military-to-military contacts were actually increasing. More visits, more trade, common interests, all that should have helped build a solid relationship.
But the sources then state, again impartially reporting the recent situation, that the relationship has taken a downturn lately.
Why? Renewed border disputes, friction over the China-Pakistan economic corridor, and China backing Pakistan at the UN on counterterrorism issues related to India. It really underlines how complex and, frankly, fragile this major relationship is.
Okay, the sources also touch briefly on two other key players in Asia, Japan and South Korea.
Right. Japan, obviously known globally for its high-tech industries, Sony, Toyota, all those brands. And its incredible economic rebound after World War II, despite having few natural resources.
Yeah, an early member of the OECD, third biggest economy in 2017, only Asian country in the G7, also the only nation ever hit by nuclear weapons.
And it's a huge contributor to the UN budget, about 10%, the sources say. Plus, it has that really important security alliance with the US going way back to 1951.
But then there's Article 9 of its constitution, the Peace Clause, renouncing war.
Exactly. Which makes its military situation interesting. Because even though its constitution limits military force, and it only spends about 1% of its GDP on defense, that 1% still makes its military spending the 7th largest in the world. So the sources basically pose a question directly to you, the listener. Considering Japan's economic power, its tech strength, its global role, but also these constitutional limits, can it really be seen as a truly alternative center of power in the same way as, say, the EU or China? Something to think about.
That's a good question. And then there's South Korea.
Divided from the North after World War II, the Korean War. A difficult history.
Very. But South Korea has emerged as a major Asian power thanks to its own stunning economic growth. The miracle on the Han River from the 60s through the 80s especially.
It joined the OECD too in 96, 11th largest economy in 2017, 10th highest military spending, ranks really well on Human Development Index too.
And the sources list the reasons for that success. Things like successful land reform early on, focus on rural development, huge investment in education and skills, export-driven growth, but also strong policies to redistribute wealth, good infrastructure, and effective government.
And again, globally famous brands, Samsung, LG, Hyundai, and the sources mention its growing ties with India as well. Okay, so let's try and pull this all together. What's the big picture emerging from these sources?
Well, I think the clearest message is that the world after the Cold War, according to this material, didn't become unipolar. Instead, we've seen this significant spreading out of power.
Right. The rise of the EU, ASEAN, China, alongside the continuing importance of Japan and South Korea, really shows that diffusion.
Yeah. And what's also striking is how different their approaches are, the ways they've built and now use their influence.
Totally different paths.
Absolutely. You've got the EU with its, deep integration model trying to build something beyond the nation state.
Then ASEAN, fiercely protective of national sovereignty, using this informal, cooperative way.
In China, with its unique, state-guided but increasingly market-oriented transformation. They represent really fundamentally different ideas about how you build prosperity and exert influence in the modern world.
So for you listening, the real takeaway here is that to grasp what's happening globally today, you can't just look at the traditional powers. You have to understand these other major centers, their unique methods, and the diverse forms their influence takes. It's a much more complex picture. This has been incredibly useful going through these sources you brought, really illuminating on these contemporary centers of power. Thanks for sharing them.
No problem. It's complex stuff, but important to unpack.
Definitely. And maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over, drawing from this material. Consider those starkly different approaches we just discussed. The EU's push for unity, ASEAN's focus on sovereignty, China's state-led market path. Do these just reflect different histories, or do they represent fundamentally different philosophies about what power even means in the 21st century? And if so, what could that imply for how countries interact, for international relations moving forward? Something to chew on.